We are the Church of the Larger Fellowship, a Unitarian Universalist congregation with no geographical boundary, working toward creating a global spiritual community, rooted in profound love, which cultivates wonder, imagination, and the courage to act. Adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic has been difficult for many bricks and mortar congregations. Early on in the pandemic, we were in a unique position to assist many congregations with the transition. We hosted special episodes of The View, provided advice and counseling to religious professionals, and trained congregations for live streaming worship, all while providing robust online programming for our members. From worship to covenant groups, from classes to pastoral care, and from our monthly magazine to our letter writing ministry, we have found ways to build connection and community even through the screen. We have been a model for ministry on the margins, providing services for isolated Unitarian Universalists, becoming a spiritual lifeline for our members in prison, and investing in innovative ministry. We know better than anyone how deep and meaningful connections can be formed even from a distance. Unitarian Universalists have faced many challenges in these times, and we continue to persevere and to fight for justice and equity for all people, especially during moments of crisis. We are proud to be a leader in this faith movement, and we invite you to get involved in our ministry. We strive to be a place where anyone from anywhere, anytime they need it. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Larger Fellowship. We are so excited to bring you an all-new episode of The View. The View is a weekly Unitarian Universalist talk show discussing important faith-based topics from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and multicultural perspective. Every Thursday for the past 7 years, we have welcomed guests from every corner of the world. Our guests are writers, scholars, activists, and religious thought leaders who are shaping Unitarian Universalism and society for the 21st century and beyond. I hope today's show inspires you. Hope it builds your faith. Hope it gives you perspective to see the power of Unitarian Universalism at work in your life. Enjoy the message.
Greetings, beloved. Welcome to the second episode of the 9th season of Voices of Unitarian Universalism, which we like to refer to as The View or The VU if you're Kiana Dene Perkins, who we hope we'll see at some point this season. Welcome. I am the Reverend Dr. Michael Tino, 1/3 of the lead ministry team of the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and I am happy to welcome you here. I'm looking forward to today's conversation as a balm for my soul and as an interesting dive into the world of religious exploration. It is a gray, rainy fall day here in Peekskill, New York, 40 miles north of New York City. We've had a really dry summer, so I welcome the rain and the fall, and it's going to be in the 40s overnight in the next couple days, so we might actually get some fall color here. Aisha Hauser, how are you today?
Hi, I am Aisha Hauser in Seattle, Washington, land of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish. How am I? This week has been the busiest in terms of all the jobs I have, because I have more than one, including the volunteer position of president of the Liberal Religious Educators Association, and our guest is president-elect of same said association. So I'm feeling, it's been wild. Like Mercury's in the microwave, and I blame that. I don't like Mercury. I saw it from a TikTok. It is not original, but it's very funny. And so I'm tired. And I feel like it's Thursday, but it feels like it should be 3 weeks from now. So I'm good. I'm grateful. It's been bright and sunny in Seattle, and I haven't really been able to enjoy. Thank God for my dog, who I have to walk twice a day at least. So I'm all over the place because of Mercury being in the microwave. So back to you, Michael, to introduce our very special guest.
Well, before we introduce our guest, some things going on in our world, in our association. Maybe, if you're into astrology, apparently there are 7 planets in retrograde
Oh,
right now,
oh,
which means everything is fakakta.
a
Uh,
cocktail.
that's like the official way astrologers would say it. I think fakakta, and um, I should say that Peekskill is the land of the Kitchewan and Wappinger bands of the Munsee Lenape Nation, and I'm glad to be here. But normally we would have Christina Rivera, our third of the lead ministry triumvirate here at the Church of the Larger Fellowship. Christina is having internet problems because she is currently in Boriken, known to many of us as Puerto Rico. And Christina wants all of you out there in Vulandia to know that on her Facebook page, publicly available are links for making donations to organizations doing really important work with the people of Puerto Rico. And she thanks everyone who's already donated. She has been busy using whatever gasoline she can get. It's being rationed there, so she's trying to conserve it. But whatever gasoline she can get, she is using to bring food and water to people who are without it, and fuel for people's generators. And so your donations to these organizations and to Chris's uh, mutual aid in action on the ground in Bordiken is greatly appreciated, and our hearts certainly
Yes.
are with our beloved colleague, comrade Chris, and we know that lots of folks in the CLF world are also thinking about her and her community, and the people that she's out there helping. So I wanted to say that. Do we have other things that we need to touch on before we bring Catherine into the conversation?
Well, I just wanted to, yes, to everything you said about Chris, and what's really been happening in later years with disasters is folks have been giving directly. So if you don't want to give to an organization, Chris is literally whatever it is you send to Chris, she's handing, directly to people who need it. And so that's been
Yep.
something that I've tried to do as well, just give directly to people.
Yeah, and if you're interested in organizations that are really doing good work, look them up. Don't like knee jerk donate to the Red Cross, who is not doing the on the ground disaster work in Puerto Rico right now. Um, though they do wonderful work in lots of places. Um, and so I don't want to I have friends who volunteer as disaster chaplains with them. Um, so without further ado, my I get to be part of a conversation with the current president of the Liberal Religious Educators Association, Aisha Hauser, who I get to be in conversation with a lot, and with Katharine Childs, the president elect of the Liberal Religious Educators Association, known as LREDA. And Katharine is a UU religious educator, storyteller, and curriculum writer. They serve Unitarian Universalism as the director of religious exploration at the Unitarian Church of Montreal. So will soon be the first Canadian president of the Liberal Religious Educators Association. And Montreal is on the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, which most people out there in Viewland probably know of as the Mohawk, the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So, Catherine, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Um,
We have so much.
Shall I
Go
share
ahead.
about what the weather's like here in Montreal?
Yes,
please.
Absolutely. It's a
Fantastic.
whole other country.
It's a sunny, sort of breezy day, perfect for the first day of fall. Happy fall equinox to everybody who is celebrating that occasion yesterday, today. Okay, now so I have to pull out my my temperature conversion math.
Oh, just tell us the temperature in Celsius.
It's 17 centigrade, so
Awesome.
it's
So,
in
like,
the high 60s.
make other people convert. It's
There
all
you
good.
go. Thanks, somebody else looking up on their weather app. So yeah, no, beautiful day here.
Wonderful. So let's start with like what's going on like right this second. I understand LREDA FallCon is happening in 3 weeks, and
Indeed.
the two
Aisha
of
was
you
like,
are
could it
probably
be
like
3 weeks from now? And I was like, no, it can't be 3 weeks from now, because 3 weeks from now, we are going to be knee deep in LREDA's fall conference. We are going to be gathering in Birmingham, Alabama for our Faith Made Real Living the Eighth Principle themed conference. This is a conference we've been planning since, well, it was originally supposed to happen in October of 2020.
Yep.
And it didn't happen then. And it didn't happen in April of 2021 when we first rescheduled it for. And now, come hell or high water, we are headed to Birmingham in October. It's a really exciting conference. We are engaging really deeply with the work of the Eighth Principle. We are so lucky to have Paula Cole-Jones and Sheila Shu as our theme speakers for the conference.
wonderful.
And we're also going to be putting everybody on a bus and heading to Montgomery, Alabama for the first day of our conference to do a visit and tour at the Legacy Museum and Memorial, more commonly known as the Lynching Museum, in Montgomery. And we're going to be having an immersive experience there at the museum, and then coming back for the rest of the conference and really engaging with the experience of having visited the museum and using it as a template for how we engage with our Eighth Principle work. We have folks who are going to be joining us both online and in person in Birmingham, and we're so excited to see everybody.
Oh yeah, and the hotel, we yeah, 2020 happened, and so we pushed it back once, and then we pushed it back twice, and then we had tried to negotiate another I don't know what they're called, but basically saying like, oh, in case something happens, the hotel's like, you're doing this, or you're paying us. Like it wasn't even an option. Like so we were like, even if it was the LREDA board and 3 more people, we're going to Birmingham and just hoping for the best. So that was the logistical part of putting together a conference that was supposed to happen in 2020, and like many things did not. But the other thing I want to say about this conference is we've been, and Catherine along with Eleanor Van Duzen have been, Eleanor Van Duzen had the Continental Events portfolio on the LREDA board and is the director of religious education at Foothills in Colorado. You both worked really hard and the board to be responsive and responsible with the material, right? So we're going to be careful about caucusing by ethnicity, by race, so that we know how impactful this is going to be, especially for descendants of enslaved Africans, and with other folks. But people are going, we've been very mindful about that. And I'm saying that intentionally because this isn't just we're going to go and then go to a museum. We're going to learn from this. It's going to impact everyone in very, very different ways. And we're cognizant about that. So there's been a lot of work around that as well. So thank you for that, Catherine.
Indeed, we've brought on a spiritual care director in addition to our common practice of having chaplains available at the conference. We do have somebody, though, on our organizing team, Reverend Denise Graves, who is going to be holding the spiritual care component of the conference. And we really wanted to make sure that there was somebody, first of all, who could address that part of the conference work as a person of color for our IBPOC folks who are going to be joining us at the conference. And then we also have a team who will be creating content specifically for white identity groups to engage with as well. And that's actually a part of the conference content that I have been really, really honored to be part of for the past four conferences. We brought in racial identity caucusing when I first joined the fall conference planning team. And it's been a really amazing experience. It's one of the things that we always receive amazing feedback about from the conference. People have taken the materials that we've used in the white identity groups and sent them out into congregations to be used for white identity groups as well. So it's been a practice that we've been able to disseminate out into congregations as well, which I think is really great.
And I believe it's not too late to register, right, Catherine?
It is not. We are continuing to accept registrations both for in-person gathering and also to join us for the online conference. And if you head over to the LREDA website, LREDA.org, LREDA.org, there is a registration link on the front page. You do not have to be a LREDA member to attend the conference. We are always happy to welcome ministers, seminarians, religious professionals of all job descriptions and ways that you connect with Unitarian Universalism. We're so happy to have you join us. LREDA has always been an organization on the forefront of Unitarian Universalist thought, and we welcome all religious professionals to join us in that exploration of this really important topic. And I love the way that we're addressing it with this conference. We're not just saying like eighth principle, woo. We're talking about how we can really integrate the eighth principle into the work that we do, and also giving participants an opportunity to practice what it really means to integrate a racial justice learning into their professional lives.
Amen.
That's super exciting. I have to say, as the person here who has not been involved in planning this conference, I'm really excited. I'm not traveling much these days, or maybe I'll register to go online.
It'll be great.
And I appreciate that there's an online option for that. Of course, that would mean that all three of the lead ministry team at the Church of the Larger Fellowship would be offline to attend the conference.
Okay, we'll just have to
maybe
do
that's
a
okay.
Fall-Con episode of The View. That's all.
Maybe that's okay. But like what I'm hearing, and I want to reflect this back to make sure that I'm getting this, is not only have you brought to this a compassionate lens of racial justice to allow people to do this work in ways that are meaningful to them wherever they're coming from racially, but like you've added this layer of experiential learning, which is going to be powerful, and the two of those have to play against one another, right? Because this experiential learning is racialized, going to this museum, right? So people who are black folks are going to have a very different experience of that museum than people who are white folks, and people who are neither black nor white are going to have another different kind of experience. And so I'm impressed with the ways that these things are playing off one another in the way that you've explained this, and then you're hoping that people are going to take this and bring it to congregations, right?
That's the hope. I mean, that's the hope for every fall conference, and this one I think is I feel like we kick it up a notch every year. So but yes, that's exactly right, is when, especially with racial justice work and anti-racism work, I feel like folks get stuck. They learn something, they read a book, it's like woohoo, and then the application on the ground seems to be where folks get stuck. And so we're hoping to at least model, but we don't need to stay in stuckness again, because we're drop kicking perfectionism into the sun, and it's not about being perfect. It's about practicing how to be messy, uncomfortable, not centering whiteness, because that's the part that makes the white folks the most uncomfortable. And then and we're trying to be as responsible as we can.
LREDA has always, in my experience, been an organization where we don't shy away from doing something that's hard. Certainly, folks who have joined us for our previous conferences have experienced moments of conflict and moments of harm. And I think that those things happen anytime we get together, no matter who we are. And the difference is that LREDA is not willing to sweep that under the rug. We're not willing to brush it off as an individual encounter. We recognize how much those individual encounters are a map against systemic issues. And we're not ever going to shy away from dealing with that and expecting our members to rise to the occasion and to deal with that and to really practice accountability in a loving way. And like any endeavor of this kind, I'm sure we miss the mark sometimes. I'm sure there are people who don't come away from that experience feeling like the outcome that they were hoping for is what we've achieved. But my experience of LREDA as an organization is that we always continue to try and to engage with those issues and really do our utmost to keep people at the table and to create a nurturing environment where people feel safe to share when harm has occurred, where people can be held in loving accountability and without judgment. And we are trying to practice living out those things in the world that we wish existed across our congregations, across our communities, and in our wider world. And if a group of courageous religious educators, people who have enormous creativity and often not a lot of power in the system, can really rise to that challenge and be present for those conversations, I think anybody can do it.
I'm really glad to hear you describe the LREDA culture, especially the LREDA Fall Con culture, in that way. It's not surprising to me as someone who's been to LREDA Fall Cons in many years ago. But it might be surprising to people out there in VU land who have not, because without naming any names, there have been notable misrepresentations in public discourse about things that went on at LREDA Fall Con. About conflicts and mistakes and trying to do better, and trying to do better sometimes in messy ways together on the fly in person, right? Because that seems to be like what you're trying to model. Like, we're not just going to sit back and let people be harmed. No, we're going to try and do better, even if it's messy.
Listen, that's the point of religious community, especially Unitarian Universalist religious community.
Yes.
We don't that. So here's the thing: there's very few places in modern life, and I kind of say this across the board, but I can speak to the United States, Canada, in this society, this continent. There's very few places where the space is made where something will happen, harm will occur, interpersonal, where we take the time to stop and say what happened, why, who was harmed. And it is messy, and it's painful. I've been involved in them. I've been the catalyst for some of them, not because it's not about me running around wanting to make trouble. It's that growing up in a culture that just said you have to listen and submit to God, any questioning will send you to hell. To me, I'm doing the opposite. It's like, we need to question, we need to talk, we need to understand things that are happening around us. And we do it with grace and love. I mean, even the hardest fall conference, which is 2017, was the hardest one, but the one that was probably the biggest, most controversial. And there are past few episodes about that. I don't need to get into it right now, but we stopped the entire conference because harm was being done. Mm-hmm. And we learned a lot. I mean, there was more learning And even there are people who left. There are people like maybe 2 people like I didn't sign up for this and they left. But for the folks who stayed, and even still to this day, it was like, oh, okay, we don't need to endure. We don't need to just hear people cause harm and be off the mark and just endure. And I'll tell you, life in 2022, less and less people are enduring. I'm watching Gen Z and the generations way after Gen X, which is what I think the 3 of us are, not enduring. They're like, yeah, no, this isn't working. So we're going to stop it. And I think there's something really, really powerful. And Unitarian Universalism, LREDA, we create that container because what we want to do is learn. What we do is spiritual practice, and how we do it and how we engage in conflict. And we take the time, which is I think the most precious commodity is time. And we take the time to do it. And it's a gift. And it is not without tears, not without pain. At least I've cried. I've, been upset. I've been hurt, and I've caused harm, and I've had to be the one to offer repair. So yes. And I do want to talk about Canada, because we could talk about LREDA for an hour, but go ahead, Catherine.
I'm always happy to talk about LREDA. The last thing that I just wanted to say is, many of you have probably heard a religious educator in your life say the congregation is the curriculum. And that's sort of a shorthand for the idea that if we are going to try and teach something to any group of people, we have to be living out that same thing. So if we want to create religious education programs in which children and adults are learning about conflict engagement, are learning about ethics, are learning about how to be in community with one another, if we're not practicing it in the way that we want people to absorb it, we're undermining everything that we're trying to accomplish as religious educators. So I feel like LREDA has this unique positioning where we have a group of people who are on board with living out the thing in really explicit and intentional ways.
And so the conference is the curriculum.
Indeed, yes. It is. That is exactly
every year. Even online.
I just wanted to name just how intentional it is, because it impresses me. And it just impresses me that there's such an intentional attention to dismantling a culture that says no, we made this agenda and we have to power through the agenda at all costs to people's spirits and souls and bodies. And you're like, no, actually, our spirits and our souls and our bodies are more important than the agenda, right? And I appreciate that. So Asia wants to talk about Canada. So I'm wondering, Catherine, and this is not something we've talked about on The View before, if you could give us the brief recap of the 8th principle as it is being discussed in the CUC and in Canadian UU congregations, because it's different.
It is absolutely different. So to give a little bit of the backstory, in 2019, okay, time isn't real, so we're just going to assume that all the years I'm saying are correct. And if they're not correct, everybody's just going to forgive me. In 2019,
sometime before the pandemic.
Exactly. Yeah. In the before times.
Exactly. In the before times. That's all we need to say.
In the before times, the CUC AGM approved the creation of a board committee that was a study group to look at what the process might be for Canada to adopt the 8th principle as written.
And the AGM, for non-Canadians, is the annual general meeting, which is the CUC, the Canadian Unitarian Council's version of General Assembly.
Yeah, so the CUC got on board with this whole let's hold a conference every other year so that it's more accessible thing a couple of years back. So we do an in-person conference one year and an online AGM at the same time, the off year, so that we're able to have more people who come and join us in person. But nonetheless, at this official gathering, we struck a commission to study how we might implement or join the 8th principle to our Canadian set of principles. So the Canadian Statement of Principles and Sources is, up into the 8th principle point, the same as what is listed in Article 2 of the UA bylaws. But that statement in Canada, anyway, lives outside of a bylaw document. It's a standalone. And so the study commission was looking into what the process might be, what kind of scaffolding we might want to create for a process for adopting the 8th principle. And what came of that original study commission was really the sort of what became evident was that Canadian congregations were really very much all over the place in terms of where they were in terms of racial justice, learning and action and activism. And there wasn't the kind of foundation that we would need to build an 8th principle movement already. So that study group undertook a cross Canada survey about congregational racial justice efforts, where folks were at, what supports, what information, etc. they were using, they wanted, where we wanted to get to. And so that was the initial report of that group, and that was shared out to CUC congregations. And subsequently, they did present at the 2021 online AGM a proposal that we should go forward with a process to adopt the 8th principle. At that gathering, there was a motion from the floor to say, scrap the process, let's adopt it now. And that brings us into some pretty serious Robert's Rules of Order procedural weeds. And while we are incredibly grateful to anybody who volunteers to be a parliamentarian in a meeting that runs on Robert's Rules of Order, this isn't sort of the thorny question we would wish on anybody except for a really big Robert's Rules nerd. And
even then, probably
even
not.
then, I mean, and so in the end, though that motion did pass at that meeting, the board subsequently determined that having the question called was in contravention of the bylaws. And so we did indeed have a whole process that brought us to a special meeting last November, at which a resolution to adopt the 8th principle, to join it to the existing Canadian 7 principles and now have 8, would be adopted as part of our formal documents for the CUC. So the CUC now has 8 principles and 6 sources and 5 aspirations. The aspirations document was adopted in 2016, and it's an articulation sort of where we as a national body of the denomination are encouraging our congregations to go and grow. It includes statements like, okay, wait a second, I'm going to get them right. I'm going to get them right. They're good. I'm going to get them right. Here we go. Fortunately, they're right there. So, as Canadian Unitarian Universalists, we aspire to be deeply connected, radically inclusive, actively engaged, theologically alive, and spiritually grounded.
Wow. I love it. We don't have aspirations. I mean, I'm sure we have them individually, but I don't think the UUA has aspirations. And I'm super fascinated that that y'all took it out of the bylaws.
That's a process question that I was not around to know anything about how that.
So do we not call it a process question in Canada?
Oh.
Well, I have never actually been to an AGM at which there was a procedural mic, so maybe.
So in any case, I could look this up at cuc.ca, but given that we're in the middle of a conversation, I'm not going to. I know that the thing that was passed outside of the proper channels was an amendment of what we know as
the recommendation that came from the study commission and the recommendation to the AGM was that the version of the eighth principle that we would pass was to, as the sort of the preamble is, to affirm and promote, and then it's individual and collective action to accountably dismantle racism and other systemic barriers to full inclusion.
In
And
ourselves and
that
our
is
institutions. Okay.
that's the wording that was chosen by the CUC Anti-Racism Study Group, and did have some wording amendments that happened right at the time of the official vote, but that's the format that they landed on.
Yeah, and as people who watch The View regularly will know, the Article 2 Study Commission in the UUA world has yet to put forth a final version. I mean, there's a new version, newer than General Assembly, that they're asking people to comment on, but they're looking at changing the way we do this too. So we might wind up with some aspirations. Don't don't sell the Article 2 Study Commission short, Asia. We might wind up with aspirations.
I
Like,
love it.
let's put that out there. Article 2 Study Commission, watch The View. Aspirations would be really nice, but they're thinking about like values and principles and sources too. So like more than just the document that we have now, to really make our values clear.
So I do want to ask, because when so at one point in the way before times, this Canadian Unitarian Council was a part of the UUA. So there was always a CUC, but it was, right? Michael, can you help
Well,
with this? Because
Canadian congregations were all UUA member congregations,
okay,
and they organized to support one another sort of independently of the UUA as the CUC, even though they were all parts of UUA districts at that point, which don't exist anymore, and UUA member congregations. And at one point, the CUC, I think, rightfully decided that the UUA energy was, they were tired of being the little sibling, who got ignored all the time, and that there were cultural things that Canadian congregations were dealing with that the UUA was fairly well ignoring. I was on the UUA staff when the UUA and CUC split, I will just say, and as the director of young adult and campus ministry, there were 3 offices at the UUA that remained continental, as we referred to it. Then it was the youth office, the young adult office, and the ministry and faith development office, of the credentialing for ministers and religious educators. And that was it. Everything else sort of went their separate ways. So I got to go to AGMs every year, uh, which was a lot of fun because I served Canadian congregations. Um, what do you have a sense of the state of that
So
relationship now?
there's still some things that are sort of administered jointly. Certainly, we continue to rely on Melanie Davis and the OWL program as is. And indeed, youth and young adult programming does remain continental. Though we do have excellent staff at the CUC, Casey Stainsby and Danielle Weber, who serve our youth and young adults at the CUC level. And just for the point of clarification, so Canadian congregations were part of whatever UUA district was immediately south of them. So it was sort of sliced up.
Well, except for the
lengthwise.
Western Canada district, which was completely in Canada.
Well, so I always say like Vancouver is the Boston of Canada, right? It's like the only place where there's a concentration of like more than 3 churches in the same place. So that's where our little concentration is, out on the West Coast. And I think, I mean, it's certainly something that, I mean, lots of people have heard me say. The UUA behaves as though it is the administrator of Unitarian Universalism, as a denomination, not as a national group of a denomination. Like the UUA behaves as though it's the Pope, not the bishop of the US, right? And that, like, that's a factor of who has the resources, who has how many churches are members of the UUA?
1,000
Many?
something. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like 35 in Canada, right? It's like, we're not unrealistic about where the resources are. And I should say there are still a handful of Canadian congregations who are UUA members, who maintain their membership in the UUA and can send delegates to General Assembly, but most congregations belong exclusively to the CUC.
I wonder, have there been conversations in Canada? Because I don't know of any in the United States. So, have there been conversations in Canada about what happens when the UUA principles and sources are different from the CUC ones? I mean,
It
they are
is
different now, technically.
indeed. I think it's something that's on the radar of national leadership for sure. I think my guess, and this is entirely a guess with no foundation in reality at all, is that the CUC will wait to see what the Article 2 Commission recommendations are, and then we'll probably wait until we see what the voting on them turns out to be, whether or not there will be a full principles review for Canada. I think the idea that we should have a process to look at our principles on a regular basis, which was not baked into that original CUC charter, but I think is something that a lot of people are aware is a good practice. And certainly the eighth principle process made very evident that we didn't have a structure in place to do that. And one more thing that I do want to name about the eighth principle process is that the period of time between the first vote and the second vote, the CUC staff did incredible work to make sure that there was strong process and strong support for folks over the course of that discussion time, but also that there was a lot of harm that came to especially IBPOC folks over the course of that process. And it was very evident that those supports and those systems were needed and that harm did still take place. Obviously, it's something that people have strong feelings about, and folks are not afraid to express those strong feelings, and sometimes that results in harm, and it definitely did in this case. And that's, I mean, to say it's regrettable seems sort of a throwaway, but it is indeed regrettable.
And it's important for you to say, because I don't know if the UUA is prepared to stem the harm that will happen if the Article 2 Study Commission includes a version of the eighth principle in their recommendations, which they probably will, since it was part of their charge. But there will be harm here too, and
Yeah.
we should learn from the experience of our Canadian siblings, and like maybe be prepared to reduce that harm.
Are the recommendations going to be made this GA
I
2023?
think that's the plan.
Back to Canada. What do you think the biggest difference in culture? If I know we can barely talk about United States UU culture, but there are certain things that so like for the most part, you're going to find coffee at coffee hour at any brick and mortar UU congregation, and folks are almost rabid about it. Like you can have a terrible service and people will be annoyed about it, but if there's no coffee, there's violence. Like I don't know what's gonna happen. So I'm curious if there's what in UU Canadian culture you've noticed.
There's still coffee hour. There's still spirit of life. Many of the things that we think about as sort of really standout UU things are very much also true of our Canadian congregations. I will say that many people who attend UU congregations in Canada are USians who are either living in Canada temporarily or permanently. It's certainly true of around the, in Europe, most of the UU congregations are made up of American expats. And certainly there are many of our folks who are Canadian UUs are also American UUs, and who've moved up to Canada and seek out a UU community. Folks who come to study here, folks who come for work. Where I am in Montreal, we have a huge video game industry, sort of internationally renowned video game industry here in the city, and so we have people who come from all over the world, and there are a lot of folks who are American, and so if they've come from a UU community somewhere else, they're going to bring their UU culture with them, and we continue to create a lot of what, certainly worship wise, and in our programming, much of the programming that we use, the curricula that we use, the worship resources that we use, 90% of them are produced in the States. Our UUA publications or Meadville Lombard curricula, or all of those same resources, we use them. So a lot of our cultural touchstones are the same. I would say certainly for us in Montreal, our congregation is bilingual. We do some of our programming every week in French during worship. So that's certainly a commonality that we share with congregations in the States who do programming in Spanish. And there have been opportunities for us to connect over that bilingualism, even if the languages are different. Certainly the fellowship movement in Canada was also very strong, the same way that it was in the US, and we do have many small congregations without professional clergy who are strongly supported by the CUC. Our religious educators and our ministers work in continental professional associations. So the UU Ministers of Canada, UMOC, is a chapter of the UUMA, and though the Canadian ministers are able to support each other around Canada-specific things, they are still certified by the MFC, and they are UUMA members, and our religious educators are LREDA members. So there's a lot, sort of culturally, it's very similar. I would say Canada has been very much at the forefront of developing UU resources for talking about Indigenous issues. Issues around residential school have come up much more often in Canadian discussions about racial identity than I've seen in American congregations. And certainly attitudes towards race and racism are different and the same. I think there remains, though I see it less and less, this idea of sort of saying we didn't have sort of chattel slavery of enslaved Africans in Canada in quite the same way that it existed in the US. And so, like, racism is completely different here, which is not true. The racism is very much the same. White supremacy culture is very much the same. And so one of the things that we are often pushing back against is the idea that, like, racism, not so bad in Canada. And that attitude, certainly for some white folks, feels like an out from doing the work. And excuse me. And it also means that we're talking about issues in a slightly different way. We are bringing people around to racial justice knowledge in a different way. And so the approach is slightly different, but the underlying problems are very much the same.
Did Unitarians in Canada run any residential schools like they did in the United States?
No.
Okay.
There were not any that were run by Canadian congregations, though. I mean, certainly, like, collecting funds for the mission work is certainly something that probably took place. I did some fairly extensive research, just personally, 2 years ago around Bond's mission, and really dug into a lot of original source documentation around it. to be able to speak, especially to that issue. And in Canada, also because Unitarians were not involved in administering any of the residential schools in Canada, there sort of is a feeling that as a church that we're kind of absolved from the criticisms that are levied against our Anglican or United or Catholic Church colleagues here in Canada, who were the churches that were most involved in running residential school here. And there's sort of a like, well, we didn't, go us. And it's certainly been helpful to be able to point to it and say, we did actually, the thing that we're talking about. I mean, maybe it wasn't our congregation specifically, but denominationally speaking, that's still part of our burden and our learning, and our make sure we don't do it again.
Yeah, I mean, if at the point at which you understand that as an institution we were complicit with genocide and white supremacy, like, you don't get an out. You don't get an out from that, right? And for viewers who don't know this, Unitarians did run the mission work in residential schools among the Ute people in what is known as Utah now, here in the United States. And so U.S. UU hands are dirty with respect to that history.
Is there, I was thinking you were talking, Catherine, I was wondering, is there a pet peeve you have that us in the US do or don't do? I'm just curious.
I mean, I did touch on it before. The what about Canada is sort of my constant refrain. And it is when we collude a national circumstance with what does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist, right? The number of times that I see people saying, like, what it means to be Unitarian Universalist is to be in favor or against this particular sort of current event situation that's going on. And whenever I hear that phrase, like, what it means to be UU, I always, I'm not angry about it, but I am sad because it feels like a paucity of vision, right? Is if we are going to reduce what it means to be UU to a reaction to a specific set of circumstances, we're limiting our vision of how we see ourselves as Unitarians. So I grew up in the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church in the US. And the idea that who I was as a Christian and who I was as an Anglican was informed by what happened in my local set of circumstances, but also that I was connected to something that was much bigger than my own congregation and then my own national denomination even. And it always seems to me that this sort of idea that their reactions to American political situations can define what it means to be UU also limits us in a place that I'm sure you all have noticed about UUs, is that our allegiance tends to be to our home congregation and not to Unitarian Universalism as a denomination. So what it means to me to be UU is that I go to this particular congregational building, as opposed to my allegiance is to the denomination. And it always seems to me that the alignment of Unitarian Universalism as an American religion contributes to that strain of the allegiance to the congregation, which also supports the you can't tell me what to do strain in Unitarian Universalism. And I think philosophically, those things are all connected. And I do wish that we could have a wider, bigger, more imaginative, more generative idea of what it means to be UU.
Well, thank you for that. A lot of food for thought.
Well, we have like 3 minutes left. What did we forget? What did we forget to touch on that you were really itching to tell us about?
Come to FallCon. We covered that. Support your religious educators in your congregation. Make sure that they have professional development budget to support themselves, to attend conferences, to become members of LREDA. Support your religious education programs and the kids in your congregation, not because they're your future donors, but because you want them to show up in Montreal in the first week of their studies at McGill and say, I really wish I had a community to be part of, and then they come through my doors.
Yes.
And foster an identity of Unitarian Universalism that is broad and deep.
Indeed.
And
Amen.
Connected. Is what I heard you say, like, and not insular and isolated and local and particular.
Absolutely.
An aspiration, perhaps, for us all.
Indeed. To be connected, actively engaged, and radically inclusive.
Yay, LREDA, for electing Katharine Childs president-elect. I'm so excited.
Congratulations to you on becoming president-elect. When do you become president?
June of next year. So
Okay.
I get to shadow Aisha for the year. And then she gets to dump it all on me and leave.
Yay.
I would say gently, although I did start the first LREDA board meeting, my first LREDA board meeting going, am I still president? How am I still president of LREDA? Because it's been pandemic presidency, so it feels like I've been doing this for 10 years. I love being president of LREDA. Please do not get me wrong. But the time warp since the March 2020 has been quite something. I truly am like, am I still? Yeah, apparently. And I love it. And Katharine, I will gently, on a beautiful platter that I make myself with, little tchotchkes, hand you the LREDA duties in June 2023.
And then do a little dance.
A lot of dance. Sleep.
Katharine, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure of a conversation, and I hope that our VU-viewers out there in VU land have enjoyed this as much as I have.
Oh, me
well,
too.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yay, a pleasure.
And we'll see you next week on The View.
Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to this ministry. It is because of you that this ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit clfuu.org/give for more information. We hope you will join us next week for another episode of The View.